Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I've been in this House for long enough, I think nearly 22 years, to know that governments face great difficulties and often have to adjust to circumstance. So one should get used to the fact that occasionally governments say things in this House which they intend to do, and then subsequently they are unable to do them. But I have to say the process of Brexit has brought me face to face with the fact that the underlying integrity which one hopes one will continue to see from government, even in difficult circumstances, now seems to be fast running out. And that troubles me very much, because I've been a member of the Conservative Party for over 40 years. I find myself in a state of amity with my colleagues, even though Brexit has introduced a revolutionary upheaval into our affairs, which means that we have divergent views on a specific issue, which is causing us as a party great difficulty. But notwithstanding that, we have, and the government who we are being asked to support has, to try and maintain some sustained integrity through that process. What, therefore, am I to make of a situation where only a few days ago, in order to avoid something that the government didn't want, which was the possibility of this House taking control of the order paper to debate alternatives outside of the control of the government, ministers of the Crown, standing at the dispatch box, give a series of plain assurances to the House of what the government intends to do if its deal cannot go through, in terms of how it's going to approach the negotiations with the European Union thereafter, and the sort of length of extension it is going to seek. That is what happened, and subsequently, today, these assurances have been entirely reneged upon. And most extraordinary of all, one might have expected the Right Honourable Gentleman, who's no longer in his place, the Secretary of State for the Department for Exiting the European Union, to come along and provide some coherent explanation for why this had happened. But he didn't. Indeed, the only explanation he half advanced was a total irrelevance. It was the suggestion that this was due, Mr. Speaker, to your ruling that the motion couldn't be brought forward a third time, which is of course a nonsense, because the government knows itself very well that had it wished today, it could have brought forward a motion to disapply our conventions, and had we wished to do so, to move on to a meaningful vote on its motion had it wished. And it is beyond comprehension and beyond rational analysis how a Minister of the Crown standing at this dispatch box this afternoon can say that that is a justification for having changed the position and decided that the extension is going to be extremely short. When, as I say, my right honourable friend, the member for Aylesbury, had described such a short extension on behalf of the government as being reckless. Now, of course, this is part of a wider pattern of the complete disintegration of collective responsibility in government. We have ministers coming to the dispatch box and saying entirely contradictory things. We have ministers publicly disassociating themselves from government policy and staying in post. We have ministers who come up to one in the corridors and acknowledge that the situation is very serious and they disagree with what the government is doing, continuing to serve in a cabinet with which they apparently fundamentally disagree. When my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, came to the dispatch box today at Prime Minister's questions, I confess I think it was the worst moment I have experienced since I came into the House of Commons. I have never felt more ashamed to be a member of the Conservative Party or to be asked to lend her support. She spent most of her time castigating the House for its misconduct. At no stage did she pause to consider whether it is in fact the way she is leading this government which might be contributing to this situation. I have great sympathy for her. I've known her for many years, and we had a personal friendship beyond and outside of this house. But I have to say, I could have wept. Wept to see her reduced to these straits, and wept to see the extent to which she was now simply zigzagging all over the place, rather than standing up for what the national interest must be. Now we're told that there's going to be a short extension. We're told that next week we will have an opportunity perhaps for a meaningful vote, which I very much think is going to lead to the vote being, the government's deal being rejected. Because for a whole variety of reasons, members of this House feel very strongly that it's bad for our country for differing reasons. But if I may say to my honourable friends on the front bench, that view can't simply be cast to one side, whether it comes from honourable members and friends with whom I disagree or those with whom I agree on this issue of Brexit. It can't just be lightly dismissed. It comes from their own analysis of what they think the national interest to be. And of course, that's a huge challenge for the Prime Minister, for which I have immense sympathy for her. But you don't meet that challenge by ducking and diving and avoiding and having a galaxy of ministers appear at the dispatch box and say contradictory things. You've got to face up to your responsibility. And rather than coming along and showing contempt for this House, actually trying to engage with it and making use of what this House can do pretty well, which is debate issues in a rational way, and which in itself, by a process of debate, might lead to a reasonable outcome. And I've come in for quite a lot of flack over the last 2 years because of my various amendments. But most of my amendments, Mr. Speaker, have been designed not to achieve a specific end, but to try to facilitate process.
Absolutely.
And each time I've put them up, the government has tried to prevent them. So my view is bound to be coloured of the government, which seeks to close down debate in this irrational fashion. And next week, we are going to face the same challenge again, but in a very concertinaed time frame. Yeah. We are in danger of crashing out with no deal. If the rumours are right, we are coming very close to the point where the EU, perfectly reasonably, in my judgment, may well be saying, we've had enough. And indeed, if I read the statement that's recently come out, I think that that's probably what they're saying. What are we going to do next week? What's my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, going to do next week? Are we going to extend across the House and try to reach some level of consensus and a way forward? Are we going to try to bring this sorry saga to an end by, for example, going back to the public, as was suggested by Right Honourable Gentleman, just as he spoke previously, as a possibility, and putting the options to them and asking them, which I would be perfectly prepared to do, and to support my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in doing, if that would help? Are we prepared to look at alternatives when it seems so apparent that the deal itself is going to be rejected? Just browbeating this House is going to serve no purpose at all. It brings us undoubtedly into contempt, but the contempt falls much more on the government that is doing this than on members who are voicing their individual views and doing the best they can to represent their constituents' interests. That's the challenge we now face, and we may face a very short time frame for doing it, something which on the whole I rather hoped we might avoid. Not perfect in itself, but that was the purpose of a longer extension, to enable this process to happen, which has been shut down over past weeks and months. We may now have to do it very quickly, but I have to say this in conclusion. If we do not do it, one has to ask oneself the question, what is the purpose of this government? What is it doing? How is it furthering the national interest? How is it contributing to the quiet, good governance which I think most people in this country want? We really are, I'm sorry to say this, at the 11th hour and 59th minute. The government's credibility is running out. Trust in it is running out. And unless my right honourable friend the Prime Minister, by some great exertion of will, and she has plenty of will and plenty of robustness, stands up and starts doing something different, we are going to spiral down into oblivion. And the worst part of it all is that we will deserve it.
Yes, I'll take